right, so thank you all for coming for the last adult forum of the 2022-2023 season. Today we've got a little bit of a treat for you. So first of all, happy early Juneteenth. Tomorrow is June 19th, which is known as Juneteenth. So according to Juneteenth.com, this is the oldest internationally celebrated commemoration the ending of slavery in the United States. Again, this is really internationally celebrated, really the first one, definitely some interest there. So the day celebrates when Major General Gordon Granger marched through Galveston, Texas, and read General Order Number 3. So General Order Number 3 was basically the one that freed the slaves. So according to Juneteenth.com, the order was raised as follows. People of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer. So again, the slaves are no longer to not be paid. They needed to be paid for their work. They were now had the full rights of employees, had to be released from the plantations, now had the freedom to move around. So again, this is granted not just to slaves in Galveston, but slaves in Texas. This was one of the last bastions of slavery in the United States. Texas was the last state to recognize General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Kind of look at the makeup of the Confederate States of America and kind of see how this could happen. Texas was on the western side of the Mississippi River. Texas is a pretty big state. I mean, everything's bigger in Texas. So you could see how slavery could kind of go underground a little bit within Texas. But nevertheless, when General Order Number 3 happened, the people of Texas had to release their slaves. This was the last state to do so. But in order to grasp the whole history, we have to go back to the beginning of the Civil War. You know, it's not enough just to look at this General Order Number 3 with no context. So you have to go to the forward. And it really starts with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln ran on an abolitionist platform. So he wanted to free, well, he didn't necessarily want to free the slaves. He said, if I can preserve the Union without freeing slaves, I will do it. If I have to free them all, I will do it. But his election as a president was enough to scare some of the southern slaveholding states. So 11 states seceded and joined the Confederate States of America. So we have to be careful because certainly every state in the Confederacy had slaves. That was what they were seceding over. They wanted to keep their slaves. You hear somebody talking about the Confederacy was fighting for states' rights. They were fighting for the state right to keep slaves. But not every slave state seceded. Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, those 5 states stayed. Now this is going to become very important later when discussing the Emancipation Proclamation. Keep that in the back of your mind, the 5 states did not secede. Now, initially the war did not go very well for the North. The North lost a series of battles. Basically, the South was better prepared. General Lee was a better general than many Northerners have given him credit for. But Lincoln needed a rallying cry because towards about 1862, there's some people going, why not just let him secede? Who cares about preserving the Union? He needed a cause. He needed something more concrete for people to rally around. So he settled on freeing the slaves. This is the platform that he'd run upon. This was the reason he'd gotten elected. So he wanted to free the slaves. But he couldn't just do it. He couldn't just randomly say one day, okay, it's time to free all the slaves. He had to be smart about it, had to be diplomatic about it. He had to do it at the proper time so it didn't look like a Hail Mary pass, so to speak. And that came at the Battle of Antietam. Now, the North kind of just barely won the war, or barely won the battle. Wasn't this crushing victory, but it was close enough for Abraham Lincoln to go ahead and put his plan into motion. So according to History.com, on September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in the rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforth and forever free. So again, he freed the slaves in the Confederacy, well, as much as he could. Again, he didn't really have control over the Confederacy, so he didn't necessarily free anybody. But note that the border states, their slaves were not free. Okay, so I'm from Kentucky. Those slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation because they weren't in rebellion. And that was kind of done by design, is Lincoln was afraid that states like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia, and Delaware would secede if they had to give up their slaves. This was really key in Maryland because Washington, D.C. is between Virginia and Maryland. So Maryland secedes, the U.S. Capitol is completely engulfed by enemy territory. So that's one of the reasons he focused more on the Confederacy. And in theory, there was another loophole. If a Confederate state rejoined the Union before January 1st, 1863, in theory, they could keep their slaves. In theory, the rebellion was over and they didn't need to free any slaves. So this brings us to Tasha Levy, professor of American Ethnic Studies, University of Washington. She explains, for example, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed no one. Lincoln had no real authority to free the slaves in the Confederacy. It began only as a threat to the states in rebellion and was signed on January 1st, 1863 as a military strategy. Slavery was not abolished officially till the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. So again, it would be about 3 more years before the slaves were free. But it did mark an important turning point in the war. So one thing we forget is that there were other countries who were watching the United States, like Britain and France. And Lincoln had to find a way to keep them from supporting the Confederacy, because there were some leaning sympathies towards it. So according to the Virginia Commonwealth University, before the Emancipation Proclamation, the British government watched and worried as the war continued month after month. Finally, late in the summer of 1862, British leaders said the time had come for them to intervene. They would try to help settle the American dispute. Britain would propose a peace agreement based on Northern recognition of Southern rights. If the North rejected the agreement, Britain would recognize the Confederacy. So again, they needed to accept the rights of Southerners, which theory included slaves, although, as we'll see, nobody was quite thinking about that at the moment. So Britain was ready to perhaps give their support to the Confederacy. But this is where the Emancipation Proclamation comes in. Suddenly, the war was no longer about keeping the Union together. Now it was about freeing slaves. And this had a huge impact on the way Britain looked at the war. So the Virginia Commonwealth University continues. The British people strongly opposed slavery. When they heard that the slaves would be freed, they gave their support immediately to President Lincoln and the North. Britain's peace proposals were never offered. The Emancipation Proclamation had cost the South the recognition of Britain and France. So again, France is going to follow Britain's lead in this. But again, when it became a war about freeing slaves, that was the minute the British said, we're not messing with this anymore. we don't support slavery, we can't support the Confederacy. So they backed off, and the American Civil War continued to be between the states. So this became a moral war. That was the second. So before it had just kind of been a political keep the Union together, but now Lincoln was making good on his abolitionist policies. So now it was a moral war. And this was buttressed by freed slaves such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Both spoke out quite a bit on the moral imperative to free the slaves, talked about the kind of conditions the slaves were living in. This really riled people up. Third, it opened the way for blacks to join the army. Now this is something we have to be careful about when we talk about Juneteenth. So many times we can deteriorate into a white people savior story and focus all on the white people in this. But blacks had a huge significance in ending slavery. They played a huge role in it. And we can see that in the way they joined the army. So again, we have to preserve black agency in the story. That blacks played a huge role in the Civil War, and a very important role. So, according to the Library of Congress, in 1862, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation opened the door for African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. Although many had wanted to join the war effort earlier, they're prohibited from enlisting by federal law dating back to 1792. So blacks actually had fought in the American Revolution, and there were scattered reports. I found some reports of them fighting in places like the War of 1812. But by and large, they could not join the army. The Emancipation Proclamation allowed them to do this finally. So they continued. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 African American soldiers had joined the fight. So again, massive enrollment from freed slaves, of African Americans who had lived in the North. So again, it became a war that they played a huge role in, really helped the North out. So Frederick Douglass supported the war. He drummed up support for it, and he argued, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pockets, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States. So certainly there was an equality in the army, one that we also see going through World War I and especially World War II. So certainly something to consider. Now again, most regiments were, that featured blacks were all black regiments. So there's still types of segregation in the army, but certainly blacks are joining. There also were spies for the Union Army who were black. Probably the most famous one is Harriet Tubman. So Intel.gov states, dressed as a field hand, she, Harriet Tubman, led scouting and spying missions to identify and map the locations of Confederate mines, supply areas, and troops. Tubman delivered the information to Union Colonel James Montgomery, commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, to support military operation planning. In June 1863, Harriet Tubman and Colonel Montgomery led the raid at Combahee River Ferry, using her intelligence information to navigate around the Confederate mines placed in the Combahee River. The mission successfully rescued more than 700 slaves from the plantations along the river. So even aside from her Underground Railroad work, Harriet Tubman was making huge strides in freeing slaves. So again, we have to remember the story of these black spies, soldiers. Again, they're very important, and to leave them out would be a disservice to history. So this culminated in the Union victory. Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox, and that leads to Juneteenth. So again, Texas was having a little bit of reluctance to recognize the surrender, but ultimately they gave in. And this is when General Gordon Granger marched through Galveston, Texas, and he gave General Order Number 3. Now, we have to also remember that his regiment consisted of black soldiers. There are black soldiers there when this order was issued. So Latasha Levy argues, Texas was the last state of the Confederacy to recognize General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865, usually considered the official end of the Civil War. And it was the 29th Colored Infantry Regiment that defeated Lee at Appomattox and likely traveled to Galveston with Granger. So again, blacks were instrumental in defeating Robert E. Lee, and they were instrumental in releasing this order. So according to Opal Lee, she thinks there were about 7,000 troops with General Granger when he gave General Order Number 3. Now, we'll learn more about Opal Lee in a second, but she certainly has the qualifications to say this. Very important figure in the history of Juneteenth, so keep her in the back of your mind. So there was work to do, namely making slavery illegal. So again, remember there were still the border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, and Missouri. So slaves had to be freed there. So this was done via the 13th Amendment. So it states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So again, no more slavery, no more plantations. Now the interesting thing is the note about criminals, that they can technically work unpaid. That's caused no shortage of controversy, especially in recent years. I don't want to get into that, but it's an interesting loophole people don't always know about. So Wisconsin, along with 2/3 of the states, ratified the 13th Amendment. So kind of interesting little part of Wisconsin history. We did ratify it. We were one of the states that made it into law. So ultimately, every state in the Union did ratify it, at least every state that was a part of the United States during the Civil War. Mississippi. Mississippi was the last one to do it. According to CBS, it took them 148 years to do so. In 1995, they had agreed to ratify the 13th Amendment, and for some reason, they then decided to lose the paperwork. So then a few years later, they refound the paperwork and ratified the 13th Amendment. So Mississippi was the last one to do it. So despite all these other dates, the 13th Amendment, all that, Juneteenth is the one that stuck. Juneteenth is the one where people celebrate it. So according to CNN, on June 19th, 1866, first official Juneteenth celebrated in Texas. Okay, it makes sense it would start in Texas. That's where Juneteenth took place. So Juneteenth, Milwaukee.com adds, first Juneteenth celebration includes parades, speeches, and other festivities. So again, certainly a celebration, and we can kind of see how it's celebrated today. Many of the same traditions endure. We'll talk about that later. So from there it spread. So they continue. As African Americans migrated from Texas to other parts of the country, they brought the Juneteenth celebration with them. The holiday became an important part of African American culture and was observed in cities and towns across the United States. However, it was not widely recognized outside of the African American community. So again, people had started in Texas, they had moved out, they brought Juneteenth along with them. But many people outside the Black community didn't really recognize it, didn't really know what it was. So it was a day that kind of went by them. So this continued, the holiday growing in strength, growing in popularity, but it really started catching steam during the Civil Rights Movement. So they conclude, in the 20th century, the Civil Rights Movement brought renewed attention to Juneteenth. In the 1960s and 1970s, African Americans began to celebrate the holiday as a way to assert their identity, to remember the struggles, sacrifices of their ancestors. In 1980, Juneteenth became an official holiday, state holiday in Texas, and over the years, more states have followed suit. So again, 1980 is when it's first recognized as a holiday in Texas, and soon other states began catching on. So this also started spreading through the active work of activists such as Dr. Ronald Myers. Dr. Ronald Myers would go around setting up Juneteenth celebrations. It was really a passion of his. So according to Opal Lee, he was a Baptist minister, he was a medical doctor, and a jazz musician all rolled into one. And Dr. Myers went all over these United States, setting up Juneteenth festivals and educational components. We owe him what we have today. So again, civil rights movement, Dr. Ronald Myers definitely really got the holiday going. So this wasn't enough for activists. It wasn't enough to have a celebration that was celebrated by blacks but widely unacknowledged by the wider population. It was time to make it a paid federal holiday, to put it up there with Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So one of the people who wanted to make Juneteenth a paid federal holiday was a woman named Opal Lee. I believe now she is 96. When Juneteenth was made a holiday, she was 94. Regardless, really fascinating woman, very strong woman, some very interesting stories to tell. If you ever get a chance to see an interview of her, do so. She's just amazing. So she was able to collect 1.5 million signatures, bring to the White House to have Juneteenth acknowledged as a paid federal holiday. She also went to Washington and gave a speech, which inspired 2 senators to write the bill on the same day to make Juneteenth a paid federal national holiday. So again, she's doing this in her 90s. Definitely a woman with a lot of spirit, but she's very passionate about the holiday, very passionate about racial justice, wanted it done. So when the senators wrote the bill, Lee states, "I could have done a holy dance, and I just might." So this leads us to June 7th, 2022. President Joe Biden makes Juneteenth paid federal holiday. So again, this is the most recent one. The one before was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Certainly after the hard work of activists, Juneteenth is the holiday that we have today. So in the order he writes, "Today our nation commemorates Juneteenth, a chance to celebrate human freedom, reflect on the grievous and ongoing legacy of slavery, and rededicate ourselves to rooting out the systemic racism continues to plague our society as we strive to deliver the full promise of America to every American." So again, it's not just a day of celebration, it's a day of reflection. It's a day to recall how much further we have to go. So Milwaukee is celebrating Juneteenth. There will be a parade. It's going to be a Juneteenth pageant, which is going to feature scholarships. There'll be a street festival with many vendors. Actually, on their website, you can no longer apply to be a vendor because they have all the spots filled. So certainly a huge celebration. Definitely check it out. So we can join together and celebrate freedom. But we can't sit on our laurels. As I mentioned earlier, Juneteenth is a time of reflection. Juneteenth is a time to sit back and take stock. So Opal Lee argues, we need to band together and try to work out the disparities that exist in our schools and our healthcare system, jobs. The pay should be equal for everyone doing the same job. We need to work together to eradicate these disparities. So again, we have to acknowledge the racial disparities exist. Yeah, I've kind of talked about them in other presentations, so I won't get into all of them. Perhaps we'll talk about them next year even. So what ways can we celebrate Juneteenth all year round? Certainly we don't want it to be a holiday where we celebrate, reflect, and just forget about it the rest of the year. So first, let's educate ourselves on anti-racism. It's not enough just to say we're anti-racist. Let's educate ourselves on what this is. There are books, there are videos, there's advice. We also need to give forum to Black voices. We need to create spaces for them to speak. We need to listen when they speak. Listen and really consider what's going on. So we also need to support Black businesses. This is huge. This is something that's been pushed recently. So according to the Pew Research Center, businesses majority owned by Black or African American people accounted for only 3% of all U.S. firms that were classifiable by the race and ethnicity of their owners in 2020. And Black-owned firms accounted for just 1% of gross revenue from classifiable companies this year. By comparison, Black adults comprised 12.4% the overall U.S. population in 2020, according to the Census Bureau. So again, if you have a Black business, know of one, patronize it. Support Black businesses. And also something I like to do personally is listen to radio stations with Black DJs. Listen to radio stations that discuss Black issues. Jamma 98.3, I believe that's what it's called. One of my favorite stations. Certainly something to listen to, kind of get a perspective on these issues. So again, normally this is where I'd sign off, but I do have a message. Thank you. Thank you for all the support. Thank you for those who have watched either in person or online. Thank you especially to Father Lane and Father Seth for supporting this ministry. Thank you to the parish of St. Paul's for allowing these talks to continue. I think I speak for the people of St. Paul's when I wish all of you who aren't from the parish a very happy and safe summer. Take care of yourselves. I should be back in September looking at doing more programs, maybe emphasizing philosophy because that's what I'm technically supposed to be doing, theology, some presentation on liturgy, definitely diversity topics. We'll have more topics like this. So again, have a happy, safe summer, happy Juneteenth, happy Diversity Month, and as always, live in love. Thank you.